Welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast and to our listeners and viewers around the world. We are back and here, as usual, to put out just a bit of humanism and context about Palestine. If you've been enjoying the podcast this far, please just take a second right now to subscribe, to like. All these things make a difference to us. And we are hoping to provide you with a context that is, sadly, we feel missing from mainstream legacy media. And also to highlight representation, to tell people about Palestine's very rich traditions, culture, and history. And today we have another very special guest, Raja Shehadeh. Welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast, Raja.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Raja, Shamim and I are super excited to have you with us today. Ahlan wa sahlan.
Ahlan fiki.
Well, I'm always excited to talk to writers and novelists, but let me tell you a little bit more about Raja, who is not only a Palestinian lawyer and a human rights activist, he is a prolific and award-winning writer. He also co-founded the award-winning Palestinian human rights organization Al-Haq, which do really amazing work, founded in 1979. In 2008, he won the Orwell Prize, a British award for political writing, for his book Palestinian Walks. And his book, We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I, was a finalist for the 2023 National Book Award. His new book, Forgotten, I'm so thrilled that we have a preview copy and it's right here. And that is coming out very soon. I believe that the book launches at the beginning of March in London, we just heard. It sounds like a very fascinating and important book, and we will be discussing it during this podcast. Hanan, let me start with our basic question. How do you know Raja?
So Raja's dad and uncle's family law firm were my grandfather Tawfi and my dad Fuad's lawyers in Palestine, and they were generational family friends, like with many Palestinians. And Shamim, during your first trip to Palestine with me, we attended our friend Dina's wedding in Ramallah, who is married to Nadim, also Shehadeh, Raja's cousin. So
yeah, I remember that. What a fantastic trip! There were a lot of checkpoints even back then, and I remember it was just a few miles to go from where we were to the wedding, but it took us hours, and I think we were late going through a lot of checkpoints. But anyway, off topic.
Yeah. So, Raja, your family is from Jaffa, and during the 1948 Nakba, the catastrophe, the Palestinian catastrophe, they were forcibly expelled and ended up in Ramallah, where you were born and where you live. And you're from a prominent Christian Palestinian family. Could you please share some of your family's history in Palestine and background?
My father was a prominent lawyer in Jaffa, and he had established his home, and he had married and had a daughter by 1948. And they were having a very good life. And then the 48 war happened, and he was forced to leave because in Jaffa, there were the Jewish terrorists were throwing bombs in the streets, and it was getting very dangerous. And they had a house in Ramallah, a summer house, and they decided to move into the summer house for a few weeks until things get quiet down. And then also my father thought that since Jaffa is in the Arab section of the partition scheme, it would be an Arab place and he would be able to return. And then, of course, he was never able to return. And so he stayed in Ramallah. My father was very active in politics as well. And in 1935, he wrote a small book called The ABC of the Arab Case of Palestine. And in it, he tried to explain the case. And when I read it, I thought it's amazing. It's so well written, so clear, and so good writing. And then so many things that he said then were true even today. And then, of course, after he moved to Ramallah, he became very active in an attempt to get the 194, which is the right of return, implemented. And he did everything possible. He went to Lausanne for the Conciliation Commission, UN Conciliation Commission, and he tried every possible way, meetings and so on. And then, of course, it wasn't possible. And then in 1954, he made cases against Israel for the frozen accounts, because the Israelis blocked the accounts of Palestinians who had money in British bank and in Arab bank with branches in what became Israel. And so they refused to allow the Palestinians to withdraw from these accounts, and the Palestinians were already destitute and needed money, and so it was very sad and very difficult for them. And he made a case, and he won the case, and as a result, Israel was forced to unfreeze these accounts and return them to the Palestinians. And then in 1967, he had the idea that we need to establish a Palestinian state next to Israel, and of course, do the negotiations over the right of return and compensation for the Palestinians and so on. And Israel, of course, refused to allow this to happen, and so he continued to try and died very sad that he knew that these settlements would take over the land, and he was right, of course.
Yeah, it's
and then my grandfather, Raja Shehadeh, was a prominent journalist who had Mir'at al-Sharq. He had established a newspaper called Mir'at al-Sharq, which was writing very important articles and fighting for the rights of Palestinians in Mandate Palestine. And he was a poet, and he was very prominent in Palestine.
Yeah. Wow. What an incredible legacy. I mean, so, which I with your father and grandfather being poets, writers, advocates, your dad a lawyer as well. And that was really interesting. I had no idea that the bank accounts of Palestinians were frozen. And I mean, what incredible work for your father to get those unfrozen.
I wrote all about this in the book. We could have been friends, my father and I.
Yeah.
A Palestinian memoir.
Yeah.
It's a lovely book. It's really, thanks for showing it, Raja. It's a really wonderful book, and it covers all that in detail, which is a must for anyone wanting to read it.
Yeah, these things are not well known, unfortunately.
That's what I mean. That you don't hear about these things. So this path of writing, of advocacy, I mean, I can see that it's sort of a family legacy in a way, but there's often a deeply personal journey. Was it that family history that started you on this path of being a lawyer, being a writer, or were there particular moments or experiences from your youth or childhood that pushed you along that journey?
Well, I was always interested in writing, and I wanted to be a writer, really. And also, I didn't want to be a writer who was living off his writing, because then I would be restricted in what I write. And so I went into law as a means of livelihood, and writing as a pleasure and on the side. And that was, of course, a very correct way, because it meant that I could write whatever I wanted to write. And as to human rights, it happened that I was in London and studying law. And when I came back, I was appalled to realize that the way things are in the occupied territories was so different from the way they are represented in the West. And I thought something must be said and written about it, and it cannot go on like this. And so I was invited to give a testimony in Geneva for the Committee of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinians. And that testimony went on for 3 days. And I went into all the changes that Israel had done in the law in order to enable settlements and in order to enable the changes in the occupied territories to suit Israel. And after I finished my testimony, the Secretary General of the International Commission of Jurists, Neil McDermott, was sitting there, and he told me, listen, this testimony is very good, but it will stay on the shelves of the UN and it will gather dust. So we have to do something about it. And he said, why don't we change it, put it into a book, make it into a book? And I said, yes. And he said the ICJ, the International Commission of Jurists, would publish it with Al-Haq. And so I worked with him on this, and it became one of the first publications, books called The West Bank and the Rule of Law, which described the secret legislation of the Israelis. And Neil McDermott wrote an introduction in which he said that there are very few cases in the world, such as in the oppressive regimes in South America, where the legislation is secretive, and Israel is another one. And of course, Israel was very mad at this, and then it became well known about these orders, and it opened a new avenue for investigation, and it started me off on working on these issues. And then I realized that I cannot do it alone. I need an organization. And so Al-Haq was established, and Al-Haq has been going on until now. I just met with the president director, and he tells it's flourishing like anything, even though the Israelis have tried to stop it and call it a terrorist organization.
Yeah. And let's talk about Al-Haq, which means the truth in Arabic. Actually, last year, Shamim and I attended a fundraiser in London, which was organized by our friend Suha. And actually, my auntie, Samia Halabi, donated 3 paintings to help with the fundraise. But you, as Shamim mentioned, in 1979, you co-founded it with other Palestinian lawyers. So can you just, if you can go back a bit, how it started, what it stands for? Like you said, it's facing opposition now from the Zionist settler colony, calling it a terrorist organization. Can you tell people who don't know much about Al-Haq, how the ethos and the vision and why you started it?
Well, we started it because we wanted to document and work on the human rights violations that Israel is committing. And we started it with a group of people who were volunteers, all volunteers. We didn't want it to become, people. There was no profession of human rights at that time. And we wanted to create that profession and get people to become very expert at human rights. And so we worked together and started publishing books and pamphlets and studies about all aspects of the Israeli occupation and colonization of the land, and land takeover and land use planning and settlement building and torture in prisons and administrative detention. All aspects of the occupation we covered in various pamphlets and books, and we made a good name for ourselves that whatever we did and published was listened to and taken seriously and acted upon, and it became slowly very popular and very well known. And so it grew from there, from a few people we used to do all the work ourselves, everything. We didn't have any profession, any employees. We volunteered and did all the work, and then slowly we became able to employ people, and it grew and grew, and now it has about 40 people working on it.
And it's doing amazing work.
Yeah.
And talk about...
By the way, thank you for this fundraising. I was told it went very well in London.
It went really, really well, actually. And it was a great, as Palestinians in diaspora, it's wonderful to be together in one room with like-minded people, whether Palestinians, other Arabs, Western people, towards supporting a very important cause. So it was really great. So thank you for the work you do more than anything, Raja. And talk about the activism of your family. I mean, your great uncle, who was a journalist, founded Al-Karmel newspaper in Haifa in 1908. So people didn't even know that Palestine had newspapers and a culture as rewritten by a lot of people. And your grandfather, as you said, was a judge. Your family, like mine, has deep roots in Palestine. We are Christian Palestinians, among the first Christians in the world, which a lot of people seem to forget, Christians in America and so on. And with roots in Palestine for millennia. I mean, Jesus was a Palestinian. But yet the Zionist propaganda is that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land, is an attempt to rewrite our history, to erase our ancient, rich culture of Palestine. Can you talk a bit more about this rich culture and history of Palestine?
Yes, I was just want to say that I wrote this book, Rift in Time, Travels with My Ottoman Uncle, which is also about Najib Nassar, and it is it tells his story very, very clearly, and his story is amazing because he was the very first to write in Arabic a book about the dangers of Zionism. And he, of course, as you said, was the editor of Al-Karmel newspaper, which was very important newspaper, and he published a lot in it. And then in the First World War, he was accused of treason because he was a Christian, and they thought that he would be helping the British in the war. And so he was under arrest, and he had to flee, and he had to be on the run for 3 years. And he went into Galilee and into the East Bank of Jordan, and in hiding for 3 years. And he wrote a memoir about this time, and I used that to write about it in this book. And he considered himself an Ottoman. Although he was Christian, he considered himself an Ottoman. So in Palestine, we have always been, we didn't think of ourselves as Christians separate from the Muslim community. We consider ourselves as Palestinians then and now. And there's no, actually, it's one of those places where it works very well. Christians and Muslims live together without discrimination and very well. And so the idea of land without people, for people without the land, is at the heart of the Zionist propaganda. And I think it's very important, and I think this is why Israel doesn't want to recognize Palestinians as a nation, because if it does, it will have to do its establishment myth. And I wrote a book also called What Does Israel Fear from Palestine, which is a small, short book. And I say that what Israel fears from Palestine is Palestine itself, because if Palestine is recognized, then this would mean that Israel would have to reimagine its origins and reconfigure the original myth of Israel, which they call the May 15 their Independence Day. And independence from whom?
Yes.
The British are the people who helped them build, and yet they call themselves independence from Britain. And that's because they wanted to be part of the colonized people, and they don't recognize that they caused a Nakba for the Palestinians and forced them to lose their home. And until there is a recognition of the Palestinians as a nation by Israel, and mutual recognition of Israel to Palestine and Palestine to Israel, there cannot be possibly peace at all, I think.
Yeah. And as you said, sorry, Shamim, to interrupt. As you said, the Christian Palestinians are very, very patriotic, national. Palestine comes first. There's no division. It's a religion. We're all the same people, and everyone's very proud to be Palestinian, regardless of our religion.
Absolutely.
As it should be. But Raja, you were mentioning, the formation of the State of Israel. Let's just go back to that, because I think history shapes this understanding of what's going on now. Just to recap, my understanding is there were only 33 countries, colonial powers generally, at the United Nations, who in 1947 voted to illegally partition Palestine, which was a land that, as you say, did not belong to them. But they chose to give 56% of Palestine to the Zionists without consulting the Palestinian people or even the neighboring Arab countries. So this, of course, resulted in the Zionist colony illegally stealing 78% of historic Palestine, not even 56%, and displacing and ethnically cleansing over 750,000 Palestinians during the Nakba of 1948. And then in 1949, a year later, 37 countries voted to admit the settler colony of Israel into the UN based on 3 conditions. But these 3 conditions, as I understand it, were the right of return, which you were talking about, your father was a big advocate for, equal rights to citizens within 1948 Palestine, and that Jerusalem and the surrounding areas would remain international as part of the United Nations. And so fast forward 77 odd years, none of these conditions have been fulfilled, but nobody talks about them. This is, to me, a contravention of international law. You might know better, but why has there been no accountability to this day? And how should the international system be reformed? Can it be reformed?
Well, Israel always violates its agreements, always. Small agreements and big agreements, Israel always violates. And Israel claims that or the world thinks that Israel accepted the partition. And in fact, there's not a single document in which Israel accepted the partition scheme. And in fact, they went beyond the partition, the land that was given to them by the partition scheme, even in 48, because they occupied Lid and Ramleh and Jaffa, which were part of the Arab side of the partition. And so what is known about these facts are completely contrary to what happened. And so why is the world not doing it? Because the world is, it was after the Holocaust, and after the Holocaust, and there was a lot of feeling that they have to reward the Jews after the Holocaust, which was the wrong thing to do in giving them the land of others. And so that was part of the sentiment, I think.
Yeah, and also, yes, understandably, after the Holocaust, there was a lot of concern, but I believe that there's a strong case to say that there was a strong streak of anti-Semitism in Europe, and so people were happy to be encouraging the Jewish population to emigrate.
That's part of it, definitely part of it, definitely part of it.
Yeah. So it wasn't really concern after the Holocaust; it was sort of like an opportunity to engage in, for me, anti-Semitism even more. But but so what do you think is the way around this? Is there a way that Israel can ever be made to be accountable or to international law, or should international law be reformed in some way? Because now everybody ignores the ICC and the ICJ, it feels, everybody being the Americans.
Well, it's a very bad time for the international law now, because Israel has paved the way to violating international law and getting away with it. And so it's a very bad precedent. And unless the world in the south, the southern part of the world gets more powerful, and unless we work very hard as the people who are for justice, then the likelihood that international law would be applied is very slim. So, what I've realized from my work in the law is that the law is one thing and politics is another. And you need politics behind the law in order to enforce it, because you can make excellent decisions and find excellent precedents and still not get anywhere because the politics is against you. And so one has to work on the political level as well as the legal level. But as far as the legal level is concerned, Palestine has very good grounding and very good standing. And all these the decisions, the law that give Palestinians rights are still on the books. I mean, the right of return has not lapsed, doesn't lapse. And so eventually it has to be enforced. And the time will come when it has to be enforced. How it's going to be enforced is another question, but it has to be enforced and we cannot give it up. And I think that as long as Israel denies what happened in the Nakba, then it is never going to have peace, because without Palestinians, it will never have peace. It will go from one war to another and remain a pariah state and surrounded by enemies and having to fight wars, one war after another.
Yeah. And the law and justice are two different things, as we say. And hopefully, as you said, Raja, the global south are seeing, and even the global north, people are seeing more and more what's happening. But 48 was, of course, the Nakba, and then we have the Naksa of 1967, which is another war where they illegally occupied the rest of historic Palestine, with over 300,000 indigenous Palestinian people ethnically cleansed. And So as you're a lawyer, whenever people talk about the two-state solution, they focus on the 1967 borders and they ignore the additional 22% that was stolen in 1948 that Shamim just mentioned. Why do you think this earlier land theft is excluded from negotiations? And is this a mission even legal, let alone moral?
Well, it starts with the Madrid Peace Conference, which was in 1991. And then the Americans fought for terms of reference, terms of reference that were very restrictive. And the terms of reference concentrated on the occupied territories, and even occupied territories that's concentrated on were less than, it ended up enforcing the presence of the Israelis and the settlements rather than removing them. And so the negotiations ended up in a terrible state and didn't get... the idea was that the Oslo Agreement would lead to a Palestinian state, but it's far from leading to a Palestinian state. It led to disaster. And I was involved in the first part of the thing in Washington, D.C., and I was legal advisor for the Palestinian delegation in Washington. And after a year, I realized that it's useless and hopeless, and so I left. And then, of course, the Oslo negotiations were in secret. We didn't know about them. And when they were published, I was so disappointed that I realized that we have lost a lot through them. And then I wrote a book also from Occupation in the Accords, in which I explained my point of view about the Oslo Accords. And then we see the results of the Oslo Accords now in the occupied territories, where everything is in a mess, and Israel is trying to take 60% of the land, which is called Area C, and so it will end up in worse, much worse situation than we ever were in before.
Yeah. So this is a good point to talk about apartheid, because Raja, my family are of Indian ethnicity from South Africa originally, and my parents left in the 60s because of apartheid there, because they were restricted as to where they could live and permits and all of that kind of thing. Now, you live in Ramallah. Can you describe the daily realities of apartheid there, which has been it's a crime against humanity. It's been confirmed as apartheid from everybody from Amnesty International to legal groups. There is a daily brutality of living under occupation, the roadblocks, the settlements, the separate roads. Can you describe a little bit about what daily life is like for people who haven't been to Palestine under apartheid?
Well, it goes much further than the disruptions of daily life. It goes into, we are not given rights as the people of the land. So we cannot travel freely. We cannot have family members who are outside come, even for a visit sometimes. And split families are not united. And the land is not ours. And all the natural resources are not ours. And we don't have the right to develop. And we don't have the right to make... each of the villages and cities are surrounded, and they cannot grow beyond that point. And so we have to build inward, and we become very crowded and live in crowded areas because all the land around us is taken over by the settlers. And so every city and every village is surrounded by settlements, and then the settlers have now claimed land not only for the future development, but also for shepherding. And I'm told now they even have cows to graze. And the reason they have cows is because the cows make the sheep run away. And so the Palestinian shepherds cannot graze their sheep because of the cows. And so everything is calculated to make life more difficult and restricted. And then we cannot go on hikes in the land, because if we go anywhere in the hills, we will be shot at by the settlers. And so for 2 years now, I haven't been able to hike in around Ramallah or anywhere else. And so it's a very restricted life and very biased towards the settlers, and they treat the land as theirs entirely, and don't even want to share it. So that's apartheid.
And just to add to what you said, Raja, people who don't understand what settlements look like, they're gigantic, 10, 20, 15,000 people live there with their own roads, because I think people who haven't been to Palestine can't imagine. They think it's a little settlement here and there. It's they're cities, basically. They're building on Palestinian stolen land.
Yeah, there are several really big cities, which are like Ariel, which now have a university, and are constantly on the move to enlarge, and Ma'ale Adumim, which is huge from eastern Jerusalem to almost to the Dead Sea. And so these are not tiny places, they are big, and they have been planned to be very big. And the plan was in order to build in such a way as to take as much land as possible from the Palestinians. Yeah, and this settlement plans have been devised as early as 1980 and 85 and 83, and I wrote about that in Palestinian Walks. And there was a plan to build so many settlements and to change the geography of the land, which has happened now. They changed the geography of the land. It's a colonial situation, completely colonial, entirely.
Yeah, totally. And there's such an element of dehumanization about it, like as you were saying, it's like you can't do the most basic things. And nowhere has that been more apparent than in Gaza in recent. It's been that way all the time in Gaza, but it's come to public attention, obviously, with the genocide. And still, mainstream media, complicit Western governments. Hanan and I are very big on representation, and we believe that now more than ever, it's crucial to have representation to tell people there are people like you out there. There are people who are writing, who are doing different things. So we use books and films for that, and I know that you use books to a certain extent. How much is giving a stronger representation for Palestinians part of your writing? And for those Palestinians who are not natural writers, what are other ways that they can expand their representation of Palestinians in the West?
I think the Palestinians have been doing very well now in terms of representation, because they're like you, they are making excellent films and excellent podcasts and excellent books. And out of Gaza, there have come some very good books. I was reading the Atif Abu Saif book, Don't Look Left, about his time in the first 3 months in Khan Yunis. And it's a very, very powerful book, very powerful. And even though I thought I knew what it was like, when I read this book, I felt I didn't know exactly how it was until I read the book. And so books are very important in bringing over the life as lived to the outside. And in my case, I try to do memoirs that are, for example, my book, Palestinian Walks, was about walks in the hills. And I realized that so many people in the world like walks. And so they liked reading the book because it was about walks. And through the walks, I described the legal aspects and the life and the cases that I went through and the experiences and so on. And it worked very well with people because it meant that people who liked walking, liked to read that book and through that understood very much about the land. I had done so many books in legal aspects about the land law, and yet this book made I've heard from many people that it was this book that made them understand like never before what the situation was like. And so after all these books that I had written in the law, this book came to be much more important and much more useful in terms of making people aware than anything else that I had written.
It's the human stories that hit people emotionally more than anything else. That's what Shamim and I actually say to a lot of people when you have graphs and a legal argument, which is all very important as well. But when you tell it through stories, books, films, fiction, not fiction based on reality, it makes it even more powerful.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's important. And the recent U.S. proposed plans, again, for a forced displacement and dispossession of Palestinians from Gaza, which is ethnic cleansing, and as Shamim said, it's a crime against humanity. It violates international law and basic sense of justice. And no one really wants to be forced out of their homes, of their lands. And we're seeing that people from Gaza, despite being moved around to so-called safe zones and so on, they just do not want to go. So what are your thoughts on this illegal U.S. proposal?
I was shocked when I heard it. I didn't realize that our land was for sale. And I realized that we are thought of as a pariah people, as stateless, and therefore we don't belong to the land, and they can do anything with us as they like, and it's so distressing. And then when I saw the people in Gaza move from the center to the north, like a stream of people, like a river of people, and I'm realizing that they're going to go into places which is totally demolished and not be able to find places where they can shelter. And yet they decided to go because they love the land, and it's their land, and it's their place. And so I think that is the best evidence of the feeling of people in Gaza towards the land. And it is not going to work, because people are not going to move away, even though they are in terrible conditions. And when you think of Israel and the eventualness of Israel, that these are people, civilians, who are living without shelter in winter, which is very harsh in Gaza these months, very cold and very wet. And yet they are not allowing them to bring in tents or prefabricated homes. I think that's so cruel. And I cannot get over the cruelty involved in depriving civilians. These are not soldiers, these are civilians of the means to live, not normally, but at least to survive. And yet they refuse to allow these things to go in.
And that's how badly dehumanized as Palestinians we've become, that the cruelty of it all doesn't even factor in. And let's not forget, over 80% of Palestinians from Gaza are already refugees twice over, from the 48 and 67 displacements and ethnic cleansing. So it's a continuation, and they've learned that people couldn't go back, and they don't want to leave. They know what will happen if they leave.
And this fact that they are originally from what became Israel is never mentioned in the media, although it's a very important factor. It's never mentioned.
Yeah, that's true. Refugees many times over in some cases. So, look, we have to live in hope. As you said, eventually these regimes will fall. International law will have to be put into place. Colonial ideology is inherently unsustainable, I believe. It could be generations of people who suffer before that happens. But right now we're in a phase where Western governments continue with political and military support for something that is patently unjust. So can this change in the short term? And if not, how do you keep a sense of hope and motivation for your work?
Well, I think not only is it not changing, it's getting worse, because now the West is and the United States is becoming an imperial country again, and thinking that they can play around with the world as they want. And so it's getting worse. Yeah. But my hope and my experience is that the young people are getting to be so active, so knowledgeable, so proficient in dealing with the politics and making their voice heard, that eventually it will make a difference. And remember, in South Africa also, it took many years, and it was really people's struggle that got them there. And even though the governments were for the apartheid regime, and then when it stopped being in their interest, the United States suddenly switched and one night said no to the South African apartheid government. And so there's always the hope that at some point the governments would stop being so dismissive of human rights in the occupied territories, and they would adhere to international law.
Yeah, you're right. And when people divested, boycotted in South Africa, they spoke out, they pushed their governments. And eventually it took till 2008 for the US to finally remove Nelson Mandela from the terrorist list. So the UK and the US, as always, were the last to But from your perspective, Raja, how do you see a solution and a path forward for Palestine? Because as you said, it's getting worse and worse. I'd love to know what you think.
Well, I think, first of all, the end of occupation. And the second thing is the recognition of the Palestinians' self-determination. And without these things, nothing can move forward. We must have self-determination. And then the self-determination means that we can choose what we want the future to be like. But it must be our choice and not imposed on us. And so that is my view. But end of occupation and self-determination are two crucial, fundamental issues that have to be met. And without these, there's no movement forward.
Yeah. And as we talked about the settlements, I mean, I think we have over 800,000 settlers living illegally on stolen Palestinian land. So they're making it very hard, even I think, for a two-state solution. And there's no country in the world that says, well, if you're not a certain religion, you can't have equal rights like everyone else. Well,
the International Court of Justice in The Hague has decided in just last, I think it was in July of last year, that the occupation is illegal, settlements are illegal, and the settlers must move back to Israel. And that's a decision, and pay compensation for the harm they did to the Palestinians. And that's a decision of the International Court of Justice. And so I think that we should not accept that it's not possible. In Algeria, there was 1 million settlers who had to move back to France. And even though it seemed impossible, when it became necessary for France to do it, they did it. And they moved back, and the Algerians became independent. And so even though there are a large number of settlers, their settlements are illegal, and we cannot accept illegality, and we cannot build on illegality. We have to start from the rights and the correct basis. And the correct basis are this is illegal settlements, and these settlements must end, and settlers return to Israel.
Yeah, and I think they gave them till September or October of this year to implement the new rulings.
Well, it's an advisory opinion, of course.
Yes.
Yeah. But even sorry, go ahead.
It has weight, even though.
Yes.
Even though it's an advisory opinion, it has weight.
Absolutely, and also even though it's a legal opinion. An illegal decision, I think it speaks to people's innate sense of justice, and as you say, that's become kind of a global movement now amongst many people, including a lot of young people, and keeping that momentum and activism is so important to put pressure on our governments. So do you have any advice, Raja, to Palestinians, to Nakba survivors, to Naksa survivors, or to any of the rest of us, anybody in general who want to take action and make some kind of meaningful impact? Where would you suggest people put their energy and focus?
Well, I think the important thing is not to give up, and to realize that it's a long struggle, and it will take many years, and yet it's a necessary struggle and a just struggle. And the best thing is not to resort to anger or race, to adopt the racism of the enemy. I mean, it's very important to remain sane and do things properly and carefully, and to write of the experiences of the Palestinians in a way that reaches to other human beings, and that it's very important also to try to influence the establishment media, because you can do something very good and not get anywhere because it's not published by a good publisher, because it's not done in a way that will reach many people. It's important to reach as many people as possible. And so one Palestinians have to keep, and other activists who are supporting the Palestinians must keep trying to reach as many people as possible, to tell them of the truth and the situation as it is, without exaggeration, and with very clear attention to facts and careful documentation.
Yeah. Well, as a fellow writer, we were just saying, I totally appreciate how much people respond to stories. Palestinian Walks, as you said, your book reached more people than maybe just straight legal books. Well, let's talk about your new book. I'm going to show it again here, Forgotten, Searching for Palestine's Hidden Places and Lost Memorials. Can you tell us a little bit about what people can expect from this book and why you wrote it, Raja?
Well, we wrote it because we wanted to explore the places that have not been written about and that are in the whole of geographic Palestine, not just the West Bank, less Gaza. We couldn't get to Gaza. And it started when we were walking in 2023 near a village in the border near the wall, and we saw a plaque of Egyptian soldiers who died, 22 of them who died in the 67 war. And we thought 67 war, Egyptian soldiers here, what brought them here? And so we tried to investigate this, and nobody could tell us anything about it. And so we thought this is strange, we should write about it. We wrote about this and then went on to other things that also are unknown. And then as the book was ending, an Israeli historian, Adam Raz, wrote about a case of a mass grave near this place where we found this plaque, where 82 Egyptian soldiers were killed and buried, and there was a cover-up. And so the quotes was established on it, and they were told never to speak about it. And so Israel built a theme park called Mini Israel over the mass graves.
Wow.
And we ended the book by visiting Mini Israel and writing about Mini Israel. And it was built on this mass grave. And so it was a book that developed from one thing to the other. And we went, for example, to Khan, which is like a hostel for pilgrims in the old days, and it's called Khan al-Tujjar. And this was a place where for 3 centuries pilgrims from Damascus to Cairo would stop there and exchange wares and sleep and rest. And it was a very important connecting point to the whole of the region. And in 1989, we were on a trip with the geographer Kamal Abdel Fattah, who we dedicate the book, and he showed us this place, and we realized that there's no marking for this place. And so we kept it in mind, and then we went to visit it. And it was very difficult to find it because it was covered in thistles and thorns and weeds. And so we went into this huge mass of weeds and then found it and found the ruins, and great ruins. It was an amazing place. And so we wrote about it, and we realized that Israel is so uninterested in these connections along the Levant. And then from there we went to Ras al-Naqura, where there were remnants of the tracks of the railway line that connected Beirut to Haifa. And the railway lines were still evident. And then there was a stop and border, and it was cut off. So the whole region is cut off by these borders and by these situation now, political situation. And so these are connections in Palestine. And then we went into a village, Kufr Baram, which is a village that was in the Galilee, and the people in the village did not fight in 48, and they were told to leave the village for 2 weeks, and they would be allowed to return. And they did leave, and they were never allowed to return. And then they went to the High Court, and the High Court said, they must be allowed to return. And the army refused and destroyed the village houses that was still there. And now the villagers have a church in that village, and they renovated the church, and they go and pray every Saturday, because the Saturday at least is the day off in Israel, and they pray there. And we went to pray with them, and we found this beautiful church in the middle of these ruins, and it was the attempt by the villagers to return to the village, and they said, we will never give up and we'll continue fighting. And so the book is full of these cases of places like that.
Yeah, and also, Raja, a lot of people still can't believe when we talk about the massacres from the 20s onwards and how they've built, whether kibbutz or settlements or theme parks and so on throughout. People in the West just do not believe. They think we're fabricating it, even though it's all there historically, factually available for anyone who wants to see it. So I'm glad you bring these or some of these massacres and cover-ups in your book. It's very important for people to know, as you said, factually.
One Israeli writer said the establishment of Israel is a miracle. I think the miracle is that they have been able to cover up this fact that they threw away the Palestinians and created the Nakba and never allowed them back, and kept it covered up and not spoken of. I think that's a miracle. And with all that we've done of books and films and documentaries and photographs of the Nakba, we're still unable to get it across to the world that the Nakba existed, that there were people in Palestine, that they were thrown away. I mean, it's quite amazing when you think of it. Quite amazing.
Yeah.
After all these years, we are still unable to bring it across to the world.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing, but it's also symptomatic of the fact that this erasure of history that you're talking about. Normally one celebrates the old places in one's country, but here it's because it has to support the myth that there was nobody there.
Exactly.
So I congratulate you on this wonderful book, because it really does bring alive a world that existed and that the settler colony would rather pretend did not exist.
Thank you.
Raja, you wrote the book with Penny Johnson, who's your wife. I work with Hanan, as you know, in our films, and she produces my films. How was it working together?
Well, it was very good because we complemented each other. She's the researcher, and I'm not a researcher. And we both write, and we both write well, and we both enjoy each other's writing. And so we would write and then each read the other and decide what is the best thing to put in. And then we discussed, and then we went on trips together, which was very good to go on trips together and discover these places and discuss what to add into the book and what not to add and what to keep and what to leave out. And so it gave us something to enjoy, a project that we enjoyed tremendously, and it worked very well. And sometimes we fought, but we would make it up. It wasn't very serious, but it was very enjoyable.
The same with Shamim and I drive her crazy with my spreadsheets and timelines, and she's like, you're not giving me time to be creative enough.
but it works. And you know what it is, I think if you're both passionate about something, which sounds like you and your wife are, it's it's so pleasurable to be able to share that at the deepest level with somebody who's creating something.
Absolutely.
And Raja, can you tell us a bit more about your current projects? I mean, you're doing so many things. You've written so many books, Al-Haq, everything else. And what really drives you to continue to address all the important things that you do, and what are you focusing on?
Well, I am writing another book, but I don't speak about the books that I'm writing. But otherwise, what drives me is I always feel that there's more that I need to express, and I have still a passion to express more and more and more. And now, of course, I have my diaries from 1967, which I'm trying to will edit and put online. And I think that's going to be a very important document.
Yeah.
And so...
how old were you in 1967?
16.
Okay. That that's what an interesting alive time to be experiencing all of that. We look forward to that one. And Raja, apart from your own work, you mentioned a couple of books, but are there any books that you would highly recommend to people who want to find out more about Palestine? Or we often hear that people find it too complicated, this history, but are there books that you would recommend?
I'm very fond of Edward Said's book, After the Last Sky, which is a simple book, a photography book, and very telling of the life of Palestine and Edward's beautiful writing and so on. And there's a new book by Pinkash Mishra, The World After Gaza, which I think is very, very important, very good. And then there's The Question of Palestine by Edward Said, which is very important and telling.
Wonderful.
It's a classic.
Yeah. And then there's a book that I'm very fond of, which is by Amal Ghandour, This Arab Life, Generation's Journey into Silence.
Yes.
Amal Ghandour.
We did a podcast with her last month, and actually she mentioned you, and she said she's fond of your books as well. So I think it's mutual, the admiration.
Well, she's a very good writer, I think. It's a good book.
Absolutely. And Raja, is there anything, you've lived such an incredible life, and you continue to live an incredible life of activism. So. Sorry?
So.
No, absolutely. Activism, meaning, not, more people should do that as well, but in their own way. But is there anything that you'd like to add that we didn't cover today for our audience?
No, I think you've been very comprehensive, and I think I appreciate very much your questions, and I appreciate the fact that you have asked me to do this, and I hope that it will be good for people to listen to and learn from, and thank you for doing it.
Pleasure. And I hope a lot of people look up your books and look up your work, because it's quite important.
Yes.
Thank you.
We're going to put links to Raja's work in the show notes as well. So I guess, sadly, we have to wrap up. I have just loved this conversation. Raja, thank you so much. Your eloquence, your insights, apart from the work that you do and the beautiful books that you write, it's been an absolute honor to speak to you today. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to share it with friends, to subscribe to us, and to like the episode. Your engagement really helps us to amplify voices that are grounded in humanism and in justice.
And also, thank you. And then just to add, stories and representation matter. Stay informed, stay engaged, take action. In solidarity, we'll see you next time. And a big shukran and a big thank you to you, Raja. Palestine needs more people like you, so does the world. So shukran, Raja.
My pleasure. Thank you.